New Zealand pipfruit industry takes around 20 years to develop a new apple variety up to full commercial production. The industry's success is increasingly dependent on the introduction of new products. How can the industry plan for effective research, science and technology investments for supplying products into an international marketplace which is increasingly volatile? In this workshop at Massey University, Turitea Campus, Legg introduces Peter Mellalieu to discuss the development of a strategic research and development plan for the New Zealand pipfruit industry. The project involved wide consultation with industry stakeholders, including growers, researchers and ENZA New Zealand International, the single-desk export marketer of apples and pears. The planning process incorporated a third-generation R&D management perspective, which, in contrast to traditional bottom-up, project-driven approaches to R&D management, pursues a philosophy of partnership between R&D management and other elements of the industry's general management, including marketing and sales, processing and logistics, legal affairs, and human resource management. The strategic plan is being used by researchers to develop research proposals, and by funding agencies such as ENZA and the Foundation for Research, Science and Technology to guide their priorities for funding.
Hello, I'm Legg, coordinator of the Department of Management Systems Research Seminar Series. Can I welcome you to our seminar today, in particular to the audience. I'd like to welcome staff and postgraduate students of the Massey College of Business, as well as visitors from the Turitea University campus and our neighbours from nearby research institutes. Before I introduce Peter Mellalieu, I'll outline the format for the seminar. First, Peter will summarise the essence of two papers that he's recently been involved with as both author and facilitator. After this lecture, two discussants will quiz Peter on his work. The discussants are firstly Professor Bill Bailey, Professor of Agribusiness Systems and Resource Management. Secondly, Dr. Alan Cameron, who is manager of the Management Systems Enterprise Development Program. Welcome. After the discussants have done their quizzing, we'll open up for a general discussion. Our presenter today is Dr. Peter Mellalieu. Peter first joined Massey University in 1987, following 10 years' work as a systems technologist and strategic planner with several New Zealand and overseas research, science and technology organisations. In 1996, he took a year's industrial sabbatical to establish a project learning consultancy. This was called Mind Surfers Limited. During that year, he was a project facilitator for the work he is presenting today. He returned to Massey in 1997 to design and introduce a new course in entrepreneurship, innovation and creativity, built around project learning principles. One of the projects within the course will involve students establishing a boutique video production company producing educational training videos in enterprise development. This seminar today is an example of what they'll be producing, a simulated live broadcast of a training workshop. Dr. Peter Mellalieu, welcome.
Thank you, Steve. First, I'd like to overview what I'm going to talk about today. First of all, I'm going to ask the question, why did we create a research and development strategy? To introduce that, I'll talk about a key issue which will sort of clarify the sorts of things we're going to talk about. Then I'm going to start at the end and talk about what we actually produced as a consequence of planning to produce this strategy. These two outputs included research and development strategic directions for the industry as a whole, and secondly, a research and development framework for guiding the decision-making processes in the industry. Then I'll talk about the process. How did we actually go about producing these two outputs? As part of that process, we did an industry tour, and I've got some video clip to show you of some of the things which you perhaps are less familiar with in terms of what goes on in the pipfruit industry. Then I'll talk about the project management aspects of the project, and talk about some of the implementation aspects of the plan and some of the ideas for future work. First of all, why did we create an industry-wide research and development strategy? If you take a look at this figure here, it shows the world production of Gala, which is one of the new varieties of apple which has been produced. It was produced in New Zealand several years ago, and you'll see that we had a monopoly supply situation in 1991. Within a few years, you see the production has been coming in from South Africa and from Chile, who were our other Southern Hemisphere competitors. And you can see here that within a few years' time, the production from those two countries will probably exceed what's going on in New Zealand. Now, New Zealand tends to get a higher premium for its pipfruit products because of the special features of the varieties that it develops. So it gets a premium price for several years, but as you see here, those premiums are starting to get eroded by other competitors. The other thing to note is that New Zealand is, the industry from New Zealand's perspective is important. The total industry is just over $500 million New Zealand export, and you'll see that the exports from New Zealand constitute 54% of our total production, whereas for these other countries, USA, Europe and so on, the production is a much smaller part. So we're a big player in the international trade aspects of it. So my first role with the planning team was to work on building the team, recruiting people appropriately for doing the job, and we also worked with them to establish what the objectives of our working together would be. The first was to raise the effectiveness of research and development investments in the industry. The industry spends about $11 million a year on research and development. Just under half of that, about 40%, is funded by government sources, the Foundation for Research, Science and Technology, and the other sources of funding come from ENZA International and the growers. And small amounts are done by the Crown Research Institutes themselves from their own funding. A second goal was to improve market access. As you know, particularly in agricultural trade, access to markets is often limited through technical trade barriers. And that you've no doubt heard of the recent experience with Australia, where we are limited from exporting there because of certain diseases that we have and other countries don't. To secure strategically essential research and development, it's important to find out what sorts of research and development must be kept going almost at any cost. For example, if you've got a collection of hundreds and hundreds of different varieties of apple species from around the world, it's a very easy matter to say, well, that would be nice to have that piece of land for some real estate, chop all those trees down and sell off the land. But if you decide then you want that collection back again, well, it will take you some years before you've got that strategic asset back on tap again. So it's important to identify strategic R&D assets like that and ensure that they are protected from the winds of change. Another aspect is to identify new research and development opportunities. The other one is to contribute to corporate research and development strategy and corporate strategy as a whole, general strategy of both ENZA International, but also other players within the industry. To also guide research and development funders and providers. There are several funders, which I've mentioned, and there are several providers. Massey University is a provider, Hort Research Limited is a provider, and there are several other providers. And in terms of the strategy that we're developing, it's likely there will be more funders and there will be more providers. So there needs to be a framework for guiding the decision making that they have. And all of these things are intended to contribute to improving industry competitiveness. So now we'll start at the end and look at what are the results that the planning team achieved in the 8 months that we were working together. First of all, there was an increased clarity about the strategic directions for research and development in the industry. And these were particularly explained in the green document that you have here, the Research and Development Strategy document. And they're summarised on the back of that yellow pamphlet that you have. First of all, there was product and process commercialisation, and I'll go into these in a little bit of more detail later on. We needed to improve the speed and the rate of commercialising new products, and also introducing new technologies into the process, the post-harvest areas, for example, of the industry. Another major area was to develop our capability for producing products which met the requirements for sustainable production. That means using less of the traditional agricultural chemicals and using biological means, other means for producing good quality foods. A third goal was in the area of market value optimization. The markets are diversifying. We've got more and more markets, so there's many choices as to where you send the product and what you do with the product in terms of maintaining quality. So these sorts of features mean that there's a much bigger juggling act going on in terms of getting the best value, the best return for the crops that are produced. The final sort of goal or direction area for research was to move research and development thinking towards a more investment-like approach in terms of the decisions made about it. So if we look at two of those goals, the first one, product and process commercialisation, what we're looking at here is improving the timeliness and the cost effectiveness of the commercialisation process of introducing new varieties. And the sort of measures of success, if we achieve that goal, are things such as we have more successful new products introduced. We have fewer product failures. Now, the idea of a product failure in terms of a pip fruit is that it gets to its market and it's in a sort of good condition for eating. If you have a failure, then somewhere along the way it's gone rotten, or it's got diseases or things like that. So we want to reduce the number of product failures, and of course again the objective is to get increased orchard returns. And there's several other measures of success which will be developed in support of this general kind of direction, this general goal. The second sort of goal area I'd like to talk about is that of sustainable production. That's to do with improving the sustainability of production, handling and delivery processes while ensuring wide market access. Now, increasingly, the market for pip fruit, the customers for pip fruit from the New Zealand perspective is the big retailing chains. And some of the big European chains are saying, we expect your product to be made by sustainable production processes, and they're putting on a deadline like 3 or so years. So there is a big race to come up with these sustainable production practices in the industry. Measures of success here will be that more crop is grown under a certain protocol which ensures that the sustainable market requirements are met. The second thing is that by growing them under these regimes, you've got a wider variety of market options available. You've got more choice as to where you can send the product. And a third measure of success will be things such as reduction in waste during the processing post-harvest operations. The other output that we produced was some kind of way of managing the decision-making, the information flows, particularly in relation to research and development planning in the industry. This is a summary of a more complex diagram that you've got in your handout there. And essentially it's a sort of cycle where there's an assessment of needs from the users of research and development, and here we're considering the full value chain ranging from both the orchard, the post-harvest handling, the delivery to the markets, and so on. So an assessment of the user's requirements. Then moving into the sorts of planning which we've produced in terms of this document, but also moving into corporate level planning within the various organizational entities, the various businesses within the industry. Then that starts to give rise to the funding and the program development around particular themes based around the goals that we've been talking about. We've got the execution and delivery of the specific research initiatives. We've got the evaluation of that research and development, and typically as a consequence of this cycle you've got the identification of new opportunities for research and development, which also need to feed into the needs assessment for R&D. Also over here, foresight, here we're trying to assess what new customers in the future might want, and therefore what are the implications for research and development there. Talk a little bit. We created this strategy. The process was in about 3 or 4 phases. The first was establishing the terms of reference. That was to do with specifying what I outlined before about what our objectives were for the process, and also how we'd actually go about carrying out the planning process. And that occurred over October-December 95. Then we produced the action plan, which was the process for how we would actually produce this plan. And that happened over about a month or so at the beginning of the year. Of course, this is a very difficult time of the year to be actually doing sort of planning work, because this is the key production part of the year. So there's a lot of urgent work which needs to be done responding to sort of tactical problems that come up. Then we started to create the plan, which took place over March to September. And the final phase, of course, is communicating and implementing the plan on a wider basis. Now, of course, creating the plan and developing the plan, there was a lot of consultation and communication going on over those processes. So, the project action plan, how we created that plan, there were some critical deadlines which we were working to. There was a growers' conference in September, and so that became our sort of target for having something to show, something to talk about and discuss at that conference. So that really focused the process of planning. Before that conference, though, we had to ensure that the document or our thinking was exposed to various boards within the industry to ensure that we were on track there before we went too wide with it. The methodology is what I came to call project learning, which is a blend of project management, I guess about 80% project management, so fairly strong sort of directive focus to what gets done and when it gets done, and about 20% action learning, where we were actually learning how to do the job as we were doing it. And some of the material that we were learning as we did the project were these conceptual frameworks. And the one that we found most valuable in guiding what we did was something developed by these Arthur D. Little consultants, Rosell, Sard and Erickson. And they called it a third generation research and development strategy process. Their process applied to an individual corporate entity. What we had to do was use that framework and kind of generalize it, adapt it to treating an industry as a whole, which has got several competing and collaborating organizations in it. A final part of action planning was issue identification, and we'll come to that in a minute. Before we look at the issues which guided the development of our strategy, I'd like to take you on a little tour of the industry. So can we have the video, please? What this tour shows you is some of the post-harvest operations in the industry, and we're going to be looking at a small packing house, and then we'll be looking at a larger packing house. Can we have some sound on that? So what we've got here is the apples are being sorted and weighed and classified as to their quality. You see some of the statistical quality control processes which go on there, measuring the distribution of sizes and things like that. Here's the machine that sticks those labels on the apples. Of course, each box has got a different number of apples on depending on the size of the apples. In addition to new varieties of apples being developed, there's new kinds of packaging which are developed, and of course these have major implications for the packers and so on. This is a cool store. Some of the orchards have their own cool stores. This particular small orchard operation packed both their own apples and those coming from neighbouring orchards. These are members of the pipfruit planning team and some of their associates. There's a device for testing some property of the apples. Now this is a much larger operation, a very large operation by New Zealand standards. At this point it's tea break time, so we're just getting a quick view over the whole operation. Again, extensive sort of computer monitoring in terms of the product attributes, size and qualities. Quite different labour implications compared with a more sort of family type orchard. You will have seen mostly women there, fairly stable turnover of workers there, much higher turnover of labour in this sort of operation. Again, you see the statistical analysis of what's going on there over the day. I think this new kind of packaging is intended so that you can stack a greater number of cartons on top of each other without damage. And finally, it all gets put on trucks and sent to the wharves where it's exported. There are also a number of very, very large cool stores for the final packed product. Again, these are members of the planning team. Now the particular ship that we're going to see here, the packers on the day achieved a world record for the quantity of apples that they were able to pack in a particular day. Right, so we come now to look at what were the issues that we identified which would impact on the management of research and development in the pipfruit industry. We did a brainstorming session really over a day, and various other elements came up over the remaining weeks, and we had about 40 issues which we had to sort of clarify and sort down to the most important ones which would guide our direction. The first was to build on our reputation for producing new products. We needed to build some new competitive strengths. We recognized that technology was the basis for market access in terms of these technical trade barriers that we're talking about. If you can't get into the market, it's secondary what price you're going to be getting. Third, we've got an increasing diversity of markets that we're selling product into. Fourth, the demands for sustainable production, which I've talked about before. Another one is to integrate the management of quality right through the whole value chain, from orchard right through final consumer, and be able to track and predict the sorts of qualities and changes that occur through the whole value chain. Another one is to improve the management of intellectual property. And finally, to demonstrate improved value for research and development investments. So those were the issues which we had to grapple with as we constructed our plan and set goals. Implementation of the results includes communication and dialogue, and the industry has taken an inclusive approach to communicating. So they're speaking widely about the strategy that they want to adopt. The other output was the research and development framework, and already we're getting funding decisions which are starting to align with the goals established around the plan. And I understand there's some research going on at Massey in terms of the sustainable production aspects of what we're talking about. Funding processes. The funding processes in terms of government, they've been given copies of the plan, and they are familiar with the sorts of things that we're talking about. There's been dialogue with peers within the industry in terms of growers, scientists, ENZA, people like that. There have been the industry conferences. There's been promotions, discussions with the government agencies, Forst and Morst. There's been discussions with educators, and students will be involved in critiquing the plan and the production of the plan as part of their assignments with the enterprise development courses that we're running here. So there's a lot of feedback loops and interactions going on. So what next? Some reflections and conclusions. Does innovation pay? John Kay, the English economist and business writer, he's done some analysis, and he concludes that innovation is often not a basis for a competitive advantage. As we saw with the case of Gala, you come up with a bright idea, you've spent a lot of money coming up with a bright idea, and other people see that it's a great idea, and they come in as fast followers, and they may be the ones that make out the money. So what does Kay suggest? Kay suggests that, in fact, if you can construct what he calls an organizational architecture that provides for a continuous stream of innovations, then he finds that that is a basis for a sustained competitive advantage. And some of the examples are companies which we regard as being innovative, such as Sony and 3M and Hewlett-Packard, but what Kay finds is what they have is systems and attitudes and a whole lot of other stuff in place, an architecture, he calls it, where they are able to create and introduce new innovations at a high rate. The second issue is the challenge of creating what I call the sustainable economy. These are very, very powerful market forces driving us to achieve sustainable production. In terms of the adopting the sort of technology of sustainable production, this is an extraordinary challenge. It's not just introducing tractors on the farm or things like this. It's concurrent and rapid introduction of several technologies and practices on the orchard and off the orchard over a fairly few number of years. So that's a big challenge. The second one is for industry suppliers, and I'm particularly interested to explore the implications for industry suppliers, such as the agrochemical industry, the machinery industry, the instrumentation industry. These need to be brought on board in terms of the changes which are going to go on. Finally, a more general proposition. One of my earlier readings in strategy came from Philips, the Philips organization, and they made the proposition that strategy is a pattern in a stream of decisions. And the implications of that proposition are, in terms of creating strategy, we need to discern, first of all, what are the emergent patterns. And one of the key patterns in the pipfruit industry in New Zealand has been the trend towards producing new product varieties at high premium. Another pattern has been being an offshore producer in the southern hemisphere. So we need to distill what those patterns are. Then we have to ask, are those patterns competitively sustainable? And when we look at the emergent patterns in the pipfruit industry, we find that they're under challenge. So therefore we have to create some new patterns, and that's what the document and the planning process that we've been involved in has been attempting to do, identify the new patterns which will guide strategic directions in the industry.
Well, thank you very much, Peter, for that very illustrative exposition of the process that you've gone through. I'd like to open up the discussion to, first of all, perhaps Professor Bill Bailey and then Alan Cameron. Bill, have you any specific questions you'd like to put to Peter?
Yes, thank you very much. The title of your research is Strategic Research and Development Plan for the New Zealand Pipfruit Industry. I think the title's misleading. You did an excellent job looking at some of the research technology-based considerations the industry must grapple with, but it's too narrow. I think that missing is a role for research for the markets, for the consumers, how industry can manage risk, how the industry can assure profitability. And if we look at you have an emerging R&D framework for the New Zealand pipfruit industry. We see this is brought out because missing from input to the R&D needs on your framework are the clients and the consumers, which I think is a striking issue if you're dealing with research with an industry as consumer-driven as the pipfruit industry is here in New Zealand. And so my question, several questions based upon this diagram. Why were consumers specifically left out? Two, if we look at the feedback in this particular diagram, we see that the R&D opportunities and results are coming back again to the R&D community and not being fed back to the producers. And the New Zealand pipfruit industry is a cooperative-based industry. I don't see the R&D efforts going back to the producers. And so at both ends of the value chain, the producers, I don't see the linkage there in your work, and the consumers and the clients appear to be specifically left off of your framework. And so my question is, was this intentional? And if so, why?
Right. Well, it certainly wasn't intentional, and perhaps it's the way that we've expressed the diagram. In terms of the consumers, there's two classes of consumers. There's the retail consumers, who are the ones that actually buy the product and to some extent instruct or advise us what needs to be produced. And they, for example, these mass retail chains have been saying these are the qualities that we're wanting, and in particular we're looking for the sustainable production. So that was that was a consumer directive which came through the planning processes that we were involved with.
In your planning framework, were there consumer groups or were there clients on your team?
Well, the personnel from ENZA were part of the ENZA marketing group, the technical services group, as part of marketing, and so there's an internal dialogue between them and marketing people. We were also familiar with the ENZA marketing strategy documents, and so those two informed the decisions that we were making. So there's also, a diagram like this is also very sort of linear. It suggests first you do this, then you do that, then you did that. The process was very interactive, and part of the architecture for innovation that we're trying to create there is increase this dialogue between research and development and corporate strategy making. So there were several board presentations, not just within ENZA, but also to boards of the growers' research and development committee and other growers' representative organisations. So those kinds of things went on as part of the planning process. This is really year one. We're saying this is not the final strategy. This is our first document for getting a wider dialogue, and this discussion today is inviting this broader dialogue in terms of saying, have we got it right? If not, what else should be considered? I think one of the features is also there seems to be there's a sort of a gap between marketers who tend to come from a sort of this season's let's get the stuff out the door and sold kind of framework, to scientists who perhaps take a 10, even 20-year time frame. And there's a sort of a gap between marketing strategy, which may be just a 3-year focus, and an R&D, which perhaps needs 10, 15, 20-year planning horizons. And those sorts of aspects require dialogue. Yep. Require dialogue between corporate strategy, marketers, and the scientists.
Related slightly to that, you talk about the planning process, and you describe it as being a fairly sophisticated process. It's got action planning and action research sort of elements built into that. Effectively, surely to a simpleton like me, you're saying we identified some terms of reference, we then identified some key players, then we had a series of meetings, identified some key issues, and then produced a report on that. Is that rather too simple a way of describing the process, or not?
No, that's absolutely right, yes.
Thank you.
We did also try to understand these more modern R&D frameworks for planning, and we ran tutorials and got people to try and assess, well, where is the industry in terms of benchmarking itself against third-generation planning approaches, and we're nowhere near there. That's a sort of an underlying goal, that we want to move towards these more modern architectures for innovation. But essentially, this plan, again, as I mentioned before, was sort of a crash through to get a more holistic approach to planning, and it was more or less as simple as you described.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. Alan, what?
Yes, thank you, Peter, for a very good presentation. I was interested to see that R&D was not the very narrow sort of invention element, but you spread it right through the whole industry. But one thing I was rather surprised that there was in Mission, and that was the one-desk marketing system used by the Apple and Pear Marketing Board. I would have thought, if you were looking at the whole industry and not just keeping it to a very narrow focus on R&D, that element would have come into it. Perhaps, though, the answer to that is in your terms of reference, which I personally would like to have seen what you were tasked with doing in the first place, to be able to assess how close you came to achieving that. Could you perhaps look at those 2 points?
Right. In fact, that's a very good assignment question, which I've actually set my students. We set our own task, which I outlined in the presentation, and we again discussed with our stakeholders, is this a valuable task to be achieved. The second thing, again, as you point out, that there is quite a question within the industry as to whether the single desk seller status should remain. And that, of course, was one of the 40 strategic issues that we identified at the beginning, which could impact on the way that we both carried out the project and also came up with the goals that we came up with. So it was something that we did identify, the structure of the industry, and the challenge was to come up with a framework and strategy for R&D management which would fit different scenarios in terms of whether the single desk seller remained or whether there was or whether it was lost.
So are you saying that you in fact had an open slate to begin with, or were you given fairly precise instructions in your original remit?
No, we developed our own set of instructions. The planning team developed the set of instructions. We were not given a constraint that said, you will assume a single desk seller. We were not given that kind of constraint.
No, but in terms of the job you were tasked to do, did they say, we have an open mind on it, we let you set your own rules, or did they in fact give you a list of instructions which says, don't consider the marketing side, the one desk thing is a separate issue, we want you to simply concentrate on research and development at the initial end of it, developing new types of fruit, for example, or new processes to handle that fruit? Are you fairly constrained in your...
The brief was essentially produce a research and development strategy for the pipfruit industry, and in terms of the stakeholders to that, which included at that meeting, there were growers, there were science providers, there were science funders in terms of ENZA and others, and at that meeting they established the terms of reference. We, for example, said we will only consider fresh fruit, pipfruit, but everything else had to be open. So there wasn't a constraint about whether there would be a single desk seller or not. We had to take account of that in our planning.
Good, thank you.
Bill, did you want to follow up on that or not?
Just looking at the, going back to your diagram, I do find it interesting that ENZA is not mentioned in the industry value chain at all. Just an aside. Porter has commented, Michael Porter, on all of his books on competitive advantage, has commented that if you look at the industry as a whole to try and assess competitive advantage, you're going to miss it. The competitive advantage is discrete little sections within a firm or an industry, which gives a company the competitive advantage that it needs, such as order entry. He gives as an example. And the approach that you've taken with your references is a different approach, it appears. You look at it from a more holistic standpoint. Could you comment a little bit about this conflict, a little bit versus the big picture?
Yeah. Well, the first thing, this was not an industry analysis. This was an analysis of the sub-industry, in other words, the pipfruit R&D industry, of which there were several providers and consumers.
Okay.
So in essence, we were trying to establish the basis for their competitive advantage within the broader industry.
Okay.
That makes sense? Yeah. And since too, this was the kind of first holistic strategic planning attempt, we wanted to start with the big picture, just get some basic documents and basic ideas and understanding about what strategy was. And so I see this as really the beginning of a substantial journey to refine and, as you point out, try and identify these real nodules of competitive excellence, which may well be R&D based, but R&D in combination with some other business capabilities which are there.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think it's time to open up the discussion to the audience. I know we have one question to kick off from David Hadfield. Could I ask each of you perhaps to identify yourself and your affiliation, and then pose your question?
Thanks, Steve. Well, David Hadfield, I teach on the sports program now, but as an ex-farmer, I have an interest in these matters. Peter, you talked about Chile and South Africa, and potentially there's some sleeping giants there. To what extent, in developing an R&D strategy, did you find out the potential strengths and weaknesses of the opposition, if you like, or was this not an issue?
We didn't explicitly go out to find out what their competitive R&D strengths were, but that is certainly a valuable question and certainly is something for consideration. Perhaps part of the issue there is that, from general understanding, they are competitors in the sense of Southern Hemisphere competitors. On the other hand, our advantage as a Southern Hemisphere competitor is under substantial threat from technology, namely storage technologies. We can now store apples for much longer periods without them degrading in quality. So now our competition becomes much broader than just those ones. Another aspect related to that is sources of R&D knowledge. And part of the issue is that a lot of R&D comes from overseas and comes from these countries, and similarly ours goes offshore. There's collaborations in terms of R&D, and the fight goes on, as it were, in the marketplace. And so the question of managing intellectual property, as you see, became a very high and important one to manage. So I think your question starts to relate to that, to look at our competitive strengths in R&D and compare and contrast them with key competitors overseas, and they may be new ones as we think about the future.
It's really just a question about the choices in R&D and what you close yourself off from when you go in for a strategy. Now, one of the things you seem to identify as a kind of a problem was, or an opportunity, I'm not quite sure, or a demand. There was this demand for sustainability, which to me suggested contracts, you got a fixed market, you know what you got everything kind of planned. And against that you said that there was going to be greater choice. Now, I see a kind of contradiction there. I don't kind of think your strategy is probably going to go down both paths, and I wonder, when it comes right back to it, even when it comes down to the R&D, can you really plan R&D and sort of go down choice, or pick a scheme, or else leave it open to choice?
Well, it comes back to some of the points that Bill was making. We have to respond to what the market information or the marketers in the industry are saying, and the marketers are saying our strategy is to increase the number of markets which we're going to be selling product into. So we have to understand, we have to say, well, that is going to happen, that is a given for R&D, therefore we have to work out the R&D implications of selling product into a bigger market. And that means understanding what happens to that apple, not only to Europe and America, which are kind of well-defined logistic chains that we know about, but what happens to that apple if we push it through to some of the South Asian countries. We have higher temperatures and things like that. We have to be ready to do research and development in that area. And that's really as far as we're getting in terms of the plan. It's really be ready to deal with R&D problems or questions in that area. And it's the same with sustainability. Sustainability is not it's not an R&D push. It's a market requirement to produce them. Has that answered your question?
Don't know. Like it kind of sits back on Professor Bailey's stuff on price. Who's going to pay for these very expensive apples or pipfruit or whatever? Like, we're going niche market, we've ignored pulp and all the rest of it, and we're just worrying about how can we get this top dollar stuff, and who's going to be generous enough to buy it, and for how long?
Well, those those are marketing decisions as part of marketing strategy, which becomes what R&D must respond to. It must create the basis for achieving that strategy of working at the premium end and bringing in new innovative products.
Hey, I've just got a quick question about where to from here. So I know you covered it briefly in your thing, but I don't know if I quite caught it, so I was wondering if you could clarify it. You've developed this strategy and you've emphasised a couple of times that it's the importance of getting the industry or whatever ready to act on these opportunities and so on. So what needs to happen to enable that to occur? It's all very well to have this report prepared and sitting here in this plan developed, but how is it actually, what's the next step from here? Will it actually occur and how?
Right. Okay. The key thing that happens now is if you're familiar with traditional R&D, traditional R&D is that scientists have an idea. They say, "Oh, this sounds like a good idea," and they put up that idea, and someone funds it. The idea of this is to start to sort of shape the patterns of decision making and shape the ideas that come up from scientists. So whilst the plan is not used in the sort of sense we will have this research and that specifically, what it does is guide. It influences the funders and it influences the providers. So now we have scientists and science managers reading this plan and saying, they want projects in this sort of areas to do with, say, sustainability, or areas to do with, let's say, operations research in terms of optimizing market value. So that document becomes an opportunity for researchers to say, hey, how about a project in this area? And they put it up to the funders, and the funders will say, yeah, that's good, that fits in with the strategy. So that's part of the what now from here.
One advantage of being host is that one has the opportunity to ask the last question, which I think will be a short one. And it is a question about the weather, Peter. It's well known that in areas where pipfruits are grown in New Zealand, there are from time to time quite severe hailstorms, which cause quite severe damage to crops. And if that were to happen within the next 5 or 6 years in a fairly large, major, devastating way, would the strategy that you're coming up with be able to cope with that massive destruction?
That was a short question. I think that's... I obviously don't have the technical competence to answer a question like that.
Or is it a relevant question in relation to your strategy and presentation?
I think it's a relevant question in the area of optimizing for market returns. If you've got a really good kind of operations research model or systems model of the whole industry, you can respond quickly to re-optimize where you're going to take what is salvageable crop and match it against the markets. So I think even still that falls within the strategy. Better market optimization models would deal with that sort of problem.
Scope within it. All right, well, thank you very much indeed. In conclusion, I'd like to do a few things. First of all, to thank our discussants, Professor Bill Bailey and Dr. Alan Cameron, and also you, the audience, for your questions and for coming along today. Peter, I think, would like to identify a couple of learning opportunities in relation to a couple of books which he'd like to identify, and then I'll finish off.
Yes, if you're interested in following up this kind of innovation strategy stuff, one book I'd recommend is Third Generation Research and Development Management by Roussel, Sard and Erickson. And the other one I'd recommend is this British book here, John Kay, Foundations of Corporate Success. And there's some excellent chapters on the value of innovation as a basis for competitive advantage, and also this business of organizational architecture and how you construct architectures which add value. And then, of course, there is the planning document itself, which
Yes, and to conclude, I'd just point out that Peter has published a lot of this work in a paper which is to be presented within the New Zealand Strategic Management Journal, and as he has indicated, there is a strategic research and development plan for the New Zealand pipfruit industry readily available. Peter Mellalieu, thank you very much.
Thank you.